Andrew Williamson here. Welcome back to Williamson Education. In our recent lessons, we have looked at an important rule of sorts in English language syntax. The rule that says sentences should generally follow the subject, verb, object, or SVO arrangement. Broadly speaking, the SVO syntax refers to a more general order of things in English language sentences. We place the actor of an action first, the action second, and the acted upon items third. But one thing I hope to have imparted to you in our lessons so far is the fact that while English contains many rules, it also has many important exceptions to these rules. In fact, it sometimes seems that every rule in the English language has an exception, or multiple exceptions. Today's exception has to do with a variation of the normal actor, action, acted upon arrangement of sentences. This variation is called the passive voice. As you gain exposure to English in native environments, you may notice speakers of the language using a very different syntax. It would seem that this different syntax places the object first, followed by what is called a passive voice verb, followed by a subject. Let's look at an example to see what I mean. Here's a sentence that follows this different syntax. The water bottle was lifted by the teacher. Notice, the person performing the action, the teacher, comes at the very end of the sentence, not at the beginning. Meanwhile, the object being acted upon, the water bottle, comes at the beginning of the sentence. This sentence is all turned around, all reversed. Let's look at another example of this strange syntax so that you can really understand how to identify this important exception to the actor, action, acted upon rule. Here's the next example. The cookie was eaten by the child. Once again, we have an actor, the child, who appears at the end of the sentence, and an object, the cookie, that comes at the beginning. Furthermore, we can identify the passive voice syntax here by the important to be verb in the middle of the clause, was eaten. All of these markers serve to demonstrate the rearrangement of our normal syntax. This sentence structure that I have been describing has a particular name. It is called the passive voice, because the actor in the sentence, the subject, occupies a relatively passive or inactive position in the grammar of the clause. Now, generally speaking, you will hear English language stylists warn you not to use the passive voice. Generally speaking, we want to use the standard structure because English has a strong preference for placing emphasis on performers of action in sentences. Some might say that English is a rather individualistic language in that it focuses on solo actors. Some might draw conclusions about cultural differences between English-speaking regions and the rest of the world on the basis of this theory. Mandarin Chinese, by way of contrast, tends to defer the action in the sentence to much later in the clause. Before the action is mentioned, the time and the place at which the action occurs often take priority. In this regard, Mandarin Chinese places less emphasis on the individual human actor and their action. Instead, it places emphasis on the circumstances in which that actor acts. In this regard, some might say that Mandarin is a more community-focused language than English, which is more focused on the individual. Some might say. I have sometimes wondered about these theories myself. It is certainly difficult to ignore the differences between the languages and their syntaxes. But whatever the reason or the consequence of the differences, the fact remains that English certainly functions best when actors come first and actions come later in sentences. Now that is all well and good. And all of these are the reasons that you often hear English language stylists tell you to avoid the passive structure. But I take a slightly different view. I personally do not harbor the absolute dislike for the passive voice that many other stylists do. The passive voice is not necessarily grammatically incorrect, and it can have an important place in well-developed prose. Another principle of English language prose style holds that writers should vary their sentence structures regularly. I find paragraphs that are overly dependent on the normal structure to be a bit boring. Passive structures can play an important role in diversifying your sentences. And in fact, you'll hear native English language speakers using the passive voice syntax constantly in informal conversation, once you know what to listen for. Moreover, there are certain instances in which the passive structure is not only desirable, but even required. Scientific writing in English often uses the passive voice structure. Consider this sentence, for example. Industry-leading research methods were employed to run the experiment. Here again, we have a passive structure, but one with an important difference. The logical subject of the sentence, scientists or researchers, is missing from the sentence. The person performing these methods is not mentioned anywhere. Why? There's actually a good reason for the missing words. Scientists prefer to think of themselves as removed from the process of experimentation. Unlike in personal narrative, memoir, or fiction writing, which is so much about the identity of the author, science should have nothing to do with the identity of the researcher. In fact, good science requires that any other researcher anywhere else in the world be able to follow and replicate the experiment described in a published article. So, scientists seek to remove themselves from their results, and this removal of the self is mirrored in the frequent use of the passive voice syntax in their writings. Even literary writers can have good reasons to use passive syntax. The passive voice opens up important possibilities inside the language, such as when an author wants to describe a weak or a passive character in their writing. Sometimes fiction writers use passive structures to suggest a certain passivity on the part of a particular character. I want you to imagine a character who just cannot seem to dig themselves out of a hole in life, who seems more the acted upon than the actor in the narrative. Imagine a debt that a character simply cannot find his way out of. Now imagine the author describing this character receiving a debt notice from the bank. The letter was received with dismay by the man. See what I've done with that sentence? The actor in the sentence, the man, comes last, suggesting a certain passivity. The debt notice comes first in the syntax of the sentence, suggesting a certain power. The arrangement of the items in the sentence reflects the state of affairs described by the clause. That's why it's too simple to say, as some English language prose stylists do, that the passive voice should be avoided at all costs. In fact, there are instances in which it can come quite in handy. So, in a language of exceptions, the passive structure is an important alternative to what is called active voice. It's an alternative that many people will tell you not to use, except that you will hear native English speakers using it, the passive voice, constantly. In fact, if you want to sound more native, you may find yourself using the passive voice structure more often than is officially recommended. In other words, passive voice is an exception to the active structure that you are not supposed to use, but that just about everybody uses. That's like an exception to an exception. In previous lessons, I have mused a bit on the nature of rules in the English language, and I have suggested that rules in our language are defined mostly by their exceptions. I guess the final takeaway message here is that English language users break the so-called rules of their language constantly. Learning how to speak English is in many ways a study in how and when to not follow the rules that tell you what to do. We English speakers are a community of criminals, pirates, and rogues, rule breakers all around. I'll teach you a big word, one of my favorites. The word is shibboleth. A shibboleth means a word or phrase that only certain insiders know how to use or pronounce. A shibboleth allows a community to know who belongs to the community and who does not. If you know how to pronounce the shibboleth correctly, then you are a member of the group. Rules in English function kind of like shibboleths. Knowing when to adhere to a rule and when not to is something that marks a native English speaker as such. It's kind of a shibboleth of sorts. As I have repeatedly suggested, though, you have to learn the rules first before you know how to break them. And that's what we're here to do, make you into a stylish and subtle breaker of the rules of English grammar. Well, with that, that's enough for today. Until next time, my friends, spread the word.